Children are meant to be children, and adults are meant to be adults, and in a healthy family there is no confusion about these categories. But what about the child who grew up too quickly? What about the child who was forced to cross the threshold into adulthood a little too early? Because that crossroad between youth and maturity is where we will find the parentified child. We'll find them in the morning, taking care of their brothers and sisters, dressing them up for school. In the afternoon, they'll be diffusing a shouting match between their mom and their dad. And in the evening, we will be witness to the circle of strangers and acquaintances who put their hands on their hips and say, "Wow, you really are mature for your age." So what do we make of this? Parentification is a tragically common and yet very subtle issue. There's no simple solution to multiple years and sometimes several decades of being forced to play a role which wasn't appropriate, because that's the key idea behind the parentified child wound. It's when you were a little person who was forced to be a big person in hopefully just an inappropriate manner, but unfortunately it can also be in quite a hostile or aggressive or abusive situation. There's a full spectrum when it comes to parental manipulation, so what can we do to heal this wound? Today we're addressing a question from Becky, which you're seeing on the screen, in regards to which books we can read to heal ourselves from parentification. And fortunately, I have got 3 books I'm going to recommend. I've spent some time going into the library, and I think that these 3 books are probably the most practical and immediately applicable books in my library. And interestingly, they were all published within 4 years of each other. We've got 1988, 1989, and 1992. So we're going back in time 30 years to heal our inner child, but it's well worth it. So let's dive straight into the material. Going to bring out a few select quotes, starting with this first book, Legacy of the Heart by Wayne Muller. Hopefully you can see that there. We've got a wonderful extended extract that frames the entire world of the parentified child, which I'm going to read in full because the language in this book is truly wonderful. It's mainly dealing with issues of existential and spiritual meaning as someone who is looking back on suffering in the past. I'll let Wayne speak for himself. So a quote from the book. Many of our families were confused about love. Love was neither given nor received with ease, and we were cautious and unsure about how to care for one another. Around tender feelings, we were clumsy and awkward. Even when love was intended, it could often be misinterpreted and mistrusted. To many of us, the idea of unconditional love seems abstract, foreign, somehow utopian. Much of the care in our families involved an intricate maze of contracts and conditions. If I do this or that for you, then you will behave in a caring way towards me, or at the very least, you will not hurt me. Our experience of care was fraught with covert, reciprocal contracts designed to minimize the harm we would bring to one another. Beautiful language, right? Tragic situation, but very well written. In this way, gestures of affection were actually strategic maneuvers calculated to fulfill our obligations to those around us. Caring acts were primarily defensive. Caring acts were primarily defensive. That's a key lesson for the parentified child, because it's people-pleasing to its core. It's defending the wounds in our heart and the aggression in the environment by caring, but it's actually creating a boundary via a nice gesture. Wayne continues in this quote, "If we didn't hold up our part of the caring bargain, we could be rejected, hurt, or abandoned. So we learned to be attentive, to listen to everyone else's problems, to try to be helpful when others are in pain. We cultivated an ability to construct the correct phrase, create the proper atmosphere, and generate sufficient support so that anyone in pain would feel better after they had been with us." A little bit more on the quote. "We used the language of care to buy safety, belonging, and peace. And this was a language we mastered to perfection. It's actually a whole nother paragraph that I was going to read, but in reading it out loud, I realized how long the quote is. An absolutely wonderful book for anyone who's trying to heal from the Parentified Child syndrome. But let's go straight into the second book, which follows very nicely in a different way from that first book. It's this one. It's Healing the Child Within by Charles Whitfield. And if you're thinking, wow, this book looks pretty old, yeah, it's 1989, and you can tell from Mr. Whitfield on the back. There he is, looking very much straight out of the 80s. But he's got a wonderful book here that is, I think, the most practical inner child book that I've found so far. I used to think it was John Bradshaw's Homecoming, which I've recommended in a few different videos, but this book here, it's got a good, they're in competition, not that it's competition to heal, but it does a really good job of getting very practical very quickly. I've got a little list here that expands our conversation about healing parentification, and I'm going to go through a few of the phrases that typically you'll probably be used to uttering when you look back at your childhood and you haven't quite gotten to the stage of accepting just how bad it might have been. Even if it wasn't bad in the explicit abusive sense, it's bad in the emotional safety sense. So a few quotes from Charles Whitfield for the frequently heard phrases of parentified children. Quote from the book. My childhood was fine. It happened, but they did their best. It really didn't happen that way. God will be angry at me. It just isn't right. If I express my rage, then they won't love me. Something really bad will happen. I might hurt someone, or they might hurt me. I'm the bad one. I'll forgive them, or I've already forgiven them. And finally, when someone says, hey, you might be parentified, they respond, you're bad for suggesting that I expressed my hurt and rage, or that my parents could have been bad. And these categories, in the same order, are outright denial, appeasing but detaching from the feelings, viewing pain of the trauma as a fantasy, the fourth commandment, unconscious fear of rejection, fear of the unknown, accepting the blame, false forgiving of the parents, and attacking the person who suggests doing the recovery work. Putting these two books together, side by side in your healing journey, it's going to give you a wonderful perspective, but you're going to need this third book to really see the undercurrent which flows beneath the whole conversation. And that's Healing the Shame That Binds You by John Bradshaw. I mentioned his other book, Homecoming, which focuses on the inner child a few minutes ago. John Bradshaw has appeared many times on this channel because his understanding of shame is very much a classic. It's going to be part of your inner work journey. I haven't got a quote to recommend, but I have got this wonderful page right here from the chapter heading. It's got the problem of spiritual bankruptcy with a Carl Jung quote, we have no imagination for evil, but evil has us in its grip. And the reason that I'm doing a bit of a strange angle on this book is because I trust you to buy the book and read it for yourself. But I do want to introduce the idea that we shouldn't get locked into the blame game with our parents. If this video has resonated with you and you can tell that to some degree or another you are a parentified child and it's time to heal from parentification, there will be an appropriate stage of vengeance, or at least a feeling of anger that bubbles up inside of you. I've seen it in client sessions where people get to a sudden well of rage that is hidden behind tears or hidden behind the shut down, numbed response. And it is very natural to want to send a message or call the parent and express all of that rage. But it doesn't need to happen that way because ultimately your wounding is yours to deal with. Yes, there are issues in the relationship, and yes, I'm not supporting the actions themselves, but the evil that was done unto us, very biblical language, but the evil that was done unto us was from people who didn't know what they were doing. It's the wounded parent which creates the wounded child, and if you want to stop that cycle of generational wounding, you refuse to turn your child into an adult before they're ready. You don't cross the boundaries. You let them know that they are a child, and you appropriately treat them that way, with respect, with compassion, by the parenting means that you think to be the best. And when they're an adult, or when they're moving towards adulthood and adolescence, You'll start to give them more of the full story. You won't be perhaps like your parent who was giving you adult conversations when you were 8, or maybe sharing the latest argument with the partner, or helping out the brother and sister in a way which is completely age inappropriate. But you will remember what that feels like to such a degree that it just won't happen, and at the same time you don't need to get on the phone to your mom and be like, hey, you did this to me and you effed me up, and it just won't go anywhere. If you sit for a while with that forgiveness aspect, don't rush towards forgiveness. Don't artificially smother over with a it's all fine and they're not that bad, but don't swing too aggressively into a vindictive, vengeance-based shadow boxing match with something that happened 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. That is the beginning of the peace of mind when you've healed a parentified child wound. All 3 of these books together, which I'll once more hold up, they will really help you along the journey. They are, again, the most practical books I can recommend. Please get them on Amazon or whatever secondhand book service that you want. Once more, Healing the Child Within by Charles Whitfield, The Legacy of the Heart by Wayne Muller, and Healing the Shame That Binds You by John Bradshaw. I hope this video has been useful. If you're interested in taking the conversation to the next level, we're still discussing parentification, but we're discussing how to renegotiate your adult relationships as an adult child with your adult parent in real time over in the next video. So it's the outer work of this inner work process. You can find it over here, and I'll see you over there.